They're everywhere. Everywhere you look, there's somebody with headphones in. And most of them are listening to music, whether they're walking, whether they're jogging, whether they're just lounging around, absolutely everywhere. It's like BTS fans. Researchers at McGill University argued that music can be just as addictive as fast food, money, and even alcohol. So thanks to their research, there have been headlines like, "People who say that they are addicted to music are not lying." But is that the truth? Can people really be addicted to music? Is music addiction a real thing? Find out today. So, scientists explain that pleasant sounds trigger an area of the brain known as the nucleus accumbens, aka the brain's reward center. So now we're still talking about the McGill University study. The more that participants anticipated or expected a sound, the more their brain lit up with pleasure activity, with auditory areas of gray matter becoming more synchronized and synchronous. And this area of the brain produces the feel-good chemical known as dopamine. And this region is also responsible for decision making. It's basically responsible for controlling somebody's urges. So the brain can actually become dependent upon these dopamine triggers. A 2011 study of 11 people who experienced chills while listening to music suggests that music can trigger a dopamine release when it produces an intensely emotional response, what we know as the chills. In theory, the brain could come to depend on this music-triggered dopamine production. How much evidence is there that it can? Based on some small empirical literature and some anecdotal evidence, so Dr. Arendz hypothesized that music has the potential to be addictive, carried out an empirical study. She adapted a tool that already existed called the Exercise Dependence Scale Revised, and investigated if musicians could be at risk for dependence in regard to their musical practice. So 25 musicians were recruited from German conservatories, and based on their total scores, 3 of the participants were classified as at risk for dependence, 20 were classified as non-dependent symptomatic, meaning they weren't dependent yet, but they had some symptoms of being dependent, and 2 were non-dependent asymptomatic, so they weren't dependent and they didn't have any symptoms of people who were addicted or dependent. Based on the results, Dr. Arendz claimed that there was tentative support for music practice addiction. If you have any background in like science or psychology, then you can point out some flaws with this study. So from this study alone, you can't just say that some people can be at risk for music addiction. Because first of all, the study sample was very, very small. There were only 10 people involved, by many standards, a small sample size. And then we're talking about musicians and their music practice. So this is more related to work addiction or workaholism, whatever you want to call it, rather than being addicted to music. But it might be a promising concept to understand the mental health of musicians. And like any study, it needs to be replicated by other researchers and get similar results for it to be considered somewhat valid. So essentially, there's no conclusive evidence that music addiction exists. And in the DSM-5, which is basically the manual that all mental health clinicians use to diagnose mental health illnesses, music addiction isn't listed as one of those categories. Of course, it does get updated, but the literature doesn't seem to suggest that music addiction is a real thing. But that doesn't mean that listening to music doesn't have any harmful effects. Doing too much of anything can be bad for you, and music is no exception. Being dependent on music can be a bad, and there are some standard questions that you can ask yourself if you're dependent on anything. You can ask yourself these questions with regards to music. Can you control your behavior pattern? Can you listen to music when you want? Does it cause you problems in your daily life? Are you listening to it does your listening to music interrupt other important things? Do you need it more and more and feel bad when you don't use it? This is definitely something that you ask an alcoholic or someone who has substance abuse issues. Do you use it more and more and find it harder not to use it? Do you continue to use it despite consequences and you find that you can't stop? But just ask yourself and be honest whether listening to it is harming you or is having a negative impact on your life. How do you know if you're dependent? You rely on it to manage your emotion. Listening to music can be an emotional experience. Some people use it to cope with anxiety or stressors in their life, or to improve their mood and to get motivation. And it can intensify your mood, whether a good mood or a bad mood. So now obviously when you're feeling sad, let's say you get rejected or lose your job or something, listening to a sad song can intensify those emotions. It can prolong your sadness or your grief. If you can't function function without music, or if it's distracting you from your daily tasks. If you can't function without music, that is a bad sign. There are people who use music to make challenging or unpleasant things more tolerable. Like if they're driving and there's a lot of traffic. I mean, can you handle the traffic without the music? Are you going to listen to music every single time you are anxious or you're stressed out? What if it's not available? What are you going to do then? Are you going to be agitated without it? Maybe you lose track of time when you're listening to music and you don't end up doing homework or assignments or work. Music also plays a role in substance abuse. Pretty shocking, but hear me out. For some people, the substances make them feel synchronized with the music, right? Because there are plenty of people who listen to music at clubs and then they feel in sync with the DJ, apparently. I mean, I wouldn't know. According to 2015 research, 43% of 143 people receiving treatment for a substance abuse disorder linked a specific type of music to a greater desire to use substances. 43% is not a joke. Of course, at the same time, there are people who cite music as a reason for them recovering. I mean, you should know for yourself what your triggers are and if music is contributing to your substance abuse. And I am by no means a medical or mental health professional. You, for yourself, should figure out when and where you can go without music. Maybe during a lecture or in class or at work. You might want to start there in cutting out your music use, or you can break it up with other activities. So overall, music addiction doesn't have substantial support in the literature. So there's no official category recognized by mental health clinicians or by researchers that music addiction is a real thing. However, dopamine is definitely involved in it. And it's just my personal philosophy not to get too attached to any material, any specific thing or person, because at the end of the day, these things are temporary. And if they don't exist, are you just going to become agitated and throw a tantrum? Depend on yourself. Depend on what's in here rather than what's out there, right? I'm not saying don't have friends, but don't be so dependent on other things outside of yourself. So that's all for today. I hope you guys enjoyed. Be sure to check out the other videos linked up above, either here or here. I haven't figured out yet. And I'll see you guys in the next one.